It was the kind of rise to fame that seemed destined for legend. Suzanne Tamim, born in Beirut to a modest family, dazzled audiences across the Arab world when her angelic voice first graced the stage. In her early 20s, she captured hearts as she triumphed on the renowned talent show Studio El Fan, a launchpad for the Middle East's brightest stars. From that moment, Suzanne wasn't just a singer, she was a sensation. Her beauty was magnetic, her voice mesmerizing, but beneath the glittering exterior, her life was far from charmed. Suzanne's career rocketed to heights most could only dream of, but her personal life was riddled with storms. From a young age, she seemed caught in a battle not just with the world around her, but with the very people closest to her. Failed relationships, family disputes, and legal troubles formed a darker backdrop to her glittering rise in the music industry. Fans adored her, but insiders whispered of the pressure. She carried a pressure that only grew as she climbed higher. Suzanne's allure wasn't just her talent, it was her mystery. But as the world would soon learn, that same mystery came with secrets that would ultimately seal her fate. What drove Suzanne Tamim wasn't just her talent, it was an unrelenting desire to escape the chaos that followed her. Little did anyone know, the same chaos would one day lead her into the darkest chapter of her life, a chapter that would rock the Arab world to its core. And as her career soared, the shadows of obsession, betrayal, and greed quietly gathered behind her, a storm that would break with a fury no one could have foreseen. It was a meeting that would change everything, a collision of two lives from vastly different worlds. Suzanne Tamim, the celebrated Lebanese pop star, found herself in the orbit of Egyptian billionaire Hisham Talat Mustafa in the early 2000s. He was not just a man of wealth, but a figure of immense influence, deeply entrenched in Egypt's political and business elite. For Suzanne, already navigating the turbulence of fame and personal turmoil, Hisham's presence was both a beacon of promise and a harbinger of doom. Their connection, cloaked in secrecy at first, was anything but ordinary. Hisham, known for his charm and relentless ambition, was captivated by Suzanne. Those close to him described an obsession that bordered on consuming a desire not just to love her, but to possess her. For Suzanne, who had already endured her share of controlling relationships, this connection offered both a sense of protection and a growing unease. Hisham showered her with gifts and promises, a man used to getting whatever he wanted. But Suzanne, fiercely independent despite her vulnerabilities, wasn't willing to be controlled. This dynamic, his desire for dominance, her fight for freedom, set the stage for a relationship that would spiral out of control. As whispers of their involvement began to circulate, Suzanne found herself increasingly ensnared. What started as a private affair was now a matter of public speculation, and behind the curtain of their romance, darker forces began to stir. The question lingered, was this fateful encounter the promise of salvation Suzanne sought, or had she unknowingly stepped into a trap? For those looking back, the answer seems hauntingly clear. It was the beginning of an obsession so dangerous, it would ultimately lead to her tragic demise. On a quiet July morning in 2008, the glitz of Dubai, a city known for its luxury and opulence, was shattered by the discovery of a horrifying crime. Behind the doors of a high-end apartment complex, nestled away from prying eyes, lay the lifeless body of Suzanne Tamim. She had been brutally attacked, her throat slashed with a ferocity that stunned even the most seasoned investigators. The scene was grim. Suzanne, a woman whose voice had brought joy to millions, had met a violent end that no one could have imagined. Blood stained the pristine marble floors of her apartment, a stark contrast to the life of glamour she had so carefully built. The attack was not just a killing, it was personal, deliberate, and filled with rage. News of her murder spread like wildfire, sending shockwaves through the Middle East and beyond. Suzanne was not just a celebrity, she was an icon. The brutality of her death raised chilling questions. Who could harbor such hatred for someone so beloved? What secrets had Suzanne carried with her to Dubai, and who wanted them silenced? Dubai authorities immediately launched an intense investigation. Forensics teams combed through the apartment, piecing together fragments of the last moments of her life. Surveillance footage, fingerprints, and DNA evidence hinted at a carefully planned execution, not the random act of violence it might have appeared at first glance. This was no ordinary crime. The sheer audacity of committing such a murder in a city as secure as Dubai suggested one thing: this was the work of someone powerful, someone unafraid of consequences. For Suzanne Tamim, her dream of a new beginning in Dubai had turned into her final chapter. And for the investigators, this was just the start of a case that would expose a web of obsession, betrayal, and power that reached the highest levels of society. As the shock of Suzanne Tamim's brutal murder rippled across the region, Dubai's renowned law enforcement wasted no time launching a meticulous investigation. In a city famed for its technological advancements and tight security, the evidence left behind would soon tell a chilling story. The first breakthrough came from the building's surveillance cameras. Investigators pored over hours of footage, searching for anything unusual. One particular figure caught their attention: a man entering Suzanne's luxury apartment complex on the morning of the murder. He appeared calm, confident, and purposeful. What stood out most, however, was his disguise: a baseball cap pulled low, sunglasses masking his face. Forensic teams at the scene worked tirelessly, uncovering more clues. A bloody footprint left on the marble floor and traces of DNA on Suzanne's clothing provided a roadmap to the killer. These weren't the mistakes of an amateur, but they were enough to lead investigators to their first major suspect. Within days, the trail pointed to Mohsen al-Sukari, a former Egyptian police officer with a reputation for doing the dirty work of those in power. His background in law enforcement gave him the skills to evade detection, but his calculated precision left behind enough breadcrumbs to build a case. When confronted, al-Sukari denied everything, but the evidence was overwhelming. DNA found at the crime scene matched his, and the surveillance footage placed him at the building just hours before Suzanne's body was discovered. But this was no ordinary suspect, and his arrest raised more questions than it answered. Who had sent him? What motive could drive such a calculated act of violence? The investigators knew they were only scratching the surface of a far more sinister plot. As they pressed al-Sukari for answers, one name emerged, a name that would blow the case wide open: Hisham Talat Mustafa. The revelation would turn this investigation into one of the most sensational cases the Arab world had ever seen. As investigators tightened the noose around Mohsen al-Sukari, the truth began to emerge in chilling detail. Under relentless questioning, al-Sukari cracked, confessing to a plot that went far beyond a simple murder. He admitted he had not acted alone. This was no random crime of passion. Suzanne Tamim's death had been orchestrated by none other than Egyptian billionaire and political heavyweight Hisham Talat Mustafa. According to al-Sukari, Mustafa had paid him a staggering $2 million to eliminate Suzanne. The motive? Rejection. Suzanne had ended their tumultuous relationship, and despite Mustafa's wealth and influence, she had chosen to distance herself from him. It was a decision that bruised the ego of a man unaccustomed to hearing the word no. Mustafa, who had publicly cultivated the image of a successful businessman and a pillar of the community, now stood exposed as a man driven by obsession and an insatiable need for control. Suzanne's refusal to reconcile had ignited a dangerous fury. In his eyes, if she would not be his, she would belong to no one. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Arab world. This was no ordinary crime. It was a scandal intertwining the upper echelons of society, mixing wealth, politics, and crime into a volatile cocktail. Mustafa's ties to Egypt's ruling elite only deepened the intrigue. How could a man of his stature orchestrate such a brutal act and expect to get away with it? The case was now a lightning rod for public outrage. It exposed the darker side of privilege, where power could corrupt to the point of murder. But for investigators, the confession was just the beginning. while al-Sukari's testimony painted a damning picture. Building a case against a man as influential as Mustafa would be an entirely different challenge. As the world watched, the case took on new dimensions, raising questions that were impossible to ignore. Was Mustafa the mastermind, or were there others pulling strings behind the scenes? And with such powerful forces at play, would justice truly prevail? The answers, as the trial would soon reveal, were more shocking than anyone could have imagined. When the courtroom doors opened, the eyes of the Arab world were fixed on what many called the trial of the century. On one side was Hisham Talat Mustafa, a billionaire whose name once stood for success and power. On the other, Mohsen al-Sukari, the hitman whose confession had unraveled a tale of murder, obsession, and betrayal. The stakes could not have been higher. The prosecution laid out its case with meticulous precision. Evidence was paraded before the court: surveillance footage, DNA samples, and al-Sukari's damning confession. Witnesses testified to the payment of $2 million and the chilling plot to end Suzanne Tamim's life. The image of Suzanne as a woman hunted by her powerful ex-lover gripped the public. For Mustafa, the trial was a spectacle of defiance. His legal team pulled every string, invoking his influence and wealth to counter the charges. They painted him as a victim of circumstance, denying the allegations even as the evidence mounted. In May 2009, the verdict sent shockwaves across the region. Both Mustafa and al-Sukari were sentenced to death. It was a rare and stunning outcome given Mustafa's elite status. For a brief moment, it seemed justice had triumphed over privilege. But justice in cases involving the powerful is rarely straightforward. Appeals and retrials soon followed, and the death sentence for Mustafa was overturned. In a dramatic twist, his punishment was reduced to 15 years in prison. This decision sparked outrage, with many questioning whether true justice had been served or whether Mustafa's immense influence had tipped the scales. For Suzanne's supporters, the trial had brought answers, but it also left behind a bitter taste. Justice had been handed down, but its form felt incomplete, as if the truth itself was still obscured by the shadows of power. As the dust settled on the trial, murmurs of political interference began to grow louder. Hisham Talat Mustafa wasn't just a businessman. He was a man deeply intertwined with Egypt's political elite. Among his closest connections was Gamal Mubarak, the son of then-President Hosni Mubarak and a rising figure in Egyptian politics. These ties cast a long shadow over the case. Critics speculated that Mustafa's reduced sentence was more than a legal decision. It was a calculated move to protect one of their own. How else could a man who had orchestrated such a heinous crime escape the ultimate punishment? The whispers of corruption and influence painted a grim picture of a justice system swayed by power. Was Mustafa truly held accountable, or had the legal proceedings been manipulated to safeguard Egypt's ruling class? For Suzanne's family and her supporters, this was a bitter truth to confront. The case had exposed not just the tragedy of her murder, but also the stark inequalities of a system where the rich and powerful seemed to play by a different set of rules. As the years went on, Mustafa's political ties remained a focal point for critics, a glaring example of how justice can falter when it comes face to face with wealth and influence. Even as the trial officially concluded, the questions it raised about corruption and privilege lingered, unresolved and haunting. In 2017, the story of Suzanne Tamim's murder took another shocking turn. Hisham Talat Mustafa, the man once convicted of orchestrating her death, was granted a presidential pardon after serving just 9 years of his reduced sentence. Officially, the pardon was issued on health grounds, but for many, it was yet another example of justice bending under the weight of power and privilege. The pardon reignited a firestorm of public outrage. Critics pointed to Mustafa's wealth and deep ties to Egypt's elite as the real reason for his early release. How could a man convicted in one of the most brutal and high-profile murders of the decade walk free, while Suzanne's family and supporters continued to grieve? For Suzanne's fans and those who followed the case, the pardon wasn't just a betrayal. It was a chilling reminder of how influence could rewrite the rules. While Mustafa returned to a life of relative comfort, the questions surrounding the fairness of his trial and the integrity of the justice system refused to fade. Was this truly about health, or was it a calculated move to protect a man whose connections ran too deep to be ignored? The answers remained as elusive as the justice Suzanne deserved. The story didn't end with Mustafa. Mohsen al-Sukari, the former police officer turned hitman, also found himself at the center of a legal twist. In 2020, during the Islamic holiday of Eid al-Fitr, he was among thousands of prisoners granted clemency by President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. For al-Sukari, the man who had confessed to carrying out Suzanne's murder for $2 million, this was an unimaginable stroke of luck. His life sentence, which once seemed definitive, was suddenly erased. The announcement of his release further stoked the flames of public outrage. To many, it felt as if both men responsible for Suzanne's murder had escaped true accountability. The clemency was seen not as an act of mercy, but as another example of how power and connections could rewrite justice. The release of both Mustafa and al-Sukari raised unsettling questions. Was Suzanne's death just another casualty in a world where the powerful are untouchable? Or was there more to this story, hidden behind the walls of influence and secrecy? For those still haunted by Suzanne's voice and her tragic end, the pardons weren't just a legal decision, they were a stark reminder of a system where justice remains fragile, elusive, and at times heartbreakingly incomplete. Despite the convictions and the dramatic courtroom revelations, many still believe that the full extent of the conspiracy surrounding Suzanne Tamim's murder has yet to be revealed. While Hisham Talib Mustafa and Mohsen al-Sukari were held accountable, the unanswered questions continued to loom large. Was Mustafa truly the mastermind behind the plot, or was he merely a pawn in a much larger game? What about the possible involvement of other powerful figures? Investigators never fully explored the depth of Mustafa's connections, particularly his ties to Egypt's political elite. How deep did this web of influence really go? The fact that key aspects of the investigation were left unexplored only fueled suspicions that more people were involved, including individuals who may have protected Mustafa or covered up his actions. Was there more at play than just a jilted lover's rage? Many continue to speculate that a powerful network of people shielded the truth from the public, concealing the true nature of the conspiracy. Suzanne Tamim's murder, while officially solved, remained a puzzle with missing pieces. Some believe that the full story would never be told, not by the justice system, but by the people who controlled it. As the years passed, those lingering doubts cast a shadow over the case, leaving a sense of incompleteness that couldn't be erased. The murder of Suzanne Tamim ignited an intense public reaction, sparking conversations not just about the tragedy of her death, but also about the deep societal issues it exposed. The case shone a harsh light on the perceived impunity of the elite, a recurring theme in the Arab world, where wealth and power often shield the privileged from the consequences of their actions. For many, Suzanne's death was a symbol of the stark inequalities in the region, where the powerful were seen as above the law. The fact that Mustafa, a man with such vast influence, could orchestrate such a brutal crime and still escape the full force of justice was a bitter pill for the public to swallow. The case became a point of reflection on the state of justice in the Arab world. Was the law truly impartial, or was it swayed by political affiliations, connections, and the clout of the wealthy? For Suzanne's supporters, the outcome of the case was not just a legal matter, it was a societal indictment, exposing the deep-rooted flaws in a system that allowed privilege to trump fairness. As the case unfolded and the trials concluded, the public's anger was palpable. They demanded accountability, but the tangled web of power and influence proved to be a formidable barrier. The story of Suzanne Tamim's murder, for all its shocking details, was ultimately a reflection of a society where the elite are not just wealthy, they are untouchable. And for those seeking justice, that was the hardest truth to accept. From the moment Suzanne Tamim's murder became public, the case dominated headlines, captivating audiences across the Arab world. News outlets scrambled to report on every detail, feeding an insatiable public curiosity about the tragic death of a beloved pop star and the involvement of a powerful billionaire. But as the trial unfolded, the media frenzy collided with the iron grip of censorship, particularly in Egypt. Reporting bans were swiftly imposed, stifling coverage and leaving journalists grappling with what they could and could not reveal. Egypt's government, already wary of any scandal implicating the elite, sought to control the narrative, shielding influential figures from deeper scrutiny. The censorship fueled widespread speculation. What were they hiding? Why were certain details kept from the public? Critics argued that the bans weren't about protecting the integrity of the trial, they were about protecting the powerful. This control over information became a secondary scandal, shining a spotlight on the fragile state of press freedom in the region. For the media, covering the case became a balancing act, walking the tightrope between public interest and government crackdowns. The restrictions only heightened the public's hunger for answers, and whispers of conspiracy and corruption grew louder in the absence of transparent reporting. The silencing of the press in such a high-profile case was a stark reminder of the limitations on free speech, especially when power and politics were at stake. Suzanne's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a story too explosive for the authorities to allow in full view of the public. Long before her name became synonymous with scandal, Suzanne Tamim was known for her ethereal voice and magnetic stage presence. She was a star who captured the hearts of millions, a beacon of hope and artistry for fans across the Arab world. But her tragic end cast a long shadow over her accomplishments, leaving her musical legacy entangled with the dark story of her murder. Suzanne's songs, once celebrated for their beauty and emotion, became symbols of a life cut short. Fans could no longer separate the artist from the tragedy. For those who loved her music, every note carried the weight of what could have been a career full of untapped potential, silenced far too soon. Beyond her artistry, Suzanne's life and death became a symbol of the struggles faced by women in the public eye. She was a woman who lived with extraordinary fame, but also extraordinary pressure. Her story highlighted the challenges of balancing success with personal freedom, as well as the dangers of attracting the wrong kind of attention. In death, Suzanne became more than a pop star. She became a cautionary tale, a tragic reminder of the dark forces that can lurk behind fame and wealth. Her legacy, though marred by her brutal end, endures in the hearts of her fans and the haunting beauty of her music, which continues to echo long after her voice was silenced. Suzanne Tamim's murder was not confined to one country. It spanned borders, drawing attention to the complexities of international law. The crime was committed in Dubai, orchestrated by individuals in Egypt, and involved a victim from Lebanon. This cross-border nature raised significant questions about jurisdiction and the effectiveness of international legal cooperation in such high-profile cases. Dubai, known for its state-of-the-art surveillance and strict law enforcement, handled the initial investigation with precision. However, when the trail led to Mohsen al-Sukari and ultimately Hisham Talat Mostafa in Egypt, the case became far more complicated. Would Egypt cooperate fully in extradition or prosecution, especially when one of its most influential citizens was involved? The question of where justice should be served lingered over the case. Dubai's authorities were relentless in pursuing answers, but they were ultimately reliant on Egypt to prosecute the suspects. Critics argued that this reliance left room for political interference, especially considering Mostafa's powerful connections. The case exposed the challenges of achieving justice in an interconnected world where political, legal, and jurisdictional barriers often hinder accountability. While the convictions of al-Sukari and Mostafa marked a victory for international cooperation, the lingering questions of fairness and influence highlighted the limitations of such efforts. From the moment investigators arrived at Suzanne Tamim's Dubai apartment, it was clear that this was no ordinary crime scene. The meticulous forensic analysis that followed would become the backbone of the case, providing the irrefutable evidence needed to secure convictions. Blood splatters on the marble floor and Suzanne's clothing revealed the brutality of the attack. Forensic teams collected DNA samples, which later matched Mohsen al-Sukari. This connection was a turning point as it directly tied the hitman to the scene of the murder. Surveillance footage from the luxury apartment building further solidified the case. Cameras captured al-Sukari entering the premises wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses to obscure his identity. The footage not only placed him at the scene, but also revealed his calculated demeanor, confirming that the attack was premeditated. Additional evidence came from phone records and financial transactions. Al-Sukari's confession, coupled with these pieces of hard evidence, painted a chillingly clear picture of the crime and its orchestration. The $2 million paid to him by Mostafa became a crucial link between the mastermind and the killer. The strength of the forensic evidence left little room for doubt in court, ensuring that justice could be pursued even when powerful figures were involved. But while the science behind the case illuminated the crime, it also underscored the cold, calculated nature of Suzanne's murder, making the tragedy all the more haunting. To truly understand the crime that claimed Suzanne Tamim's life, one must delve into the psychological profiles of the two men responsible for her death, Hisham Talat Mostafa and Mohsen al-Sukari. For Mostafa, the billionaire at the heart of the scandal, the crime stemmed from an obsessive need for control. Here was a man who wielded immense power in business and politics, a man unaccustomed to rejection. When Suzanne ended their tumultuous relationship and distanced herself, it wasn't just a personal loss for Mostafa. It was a blow to his ego, an affront to his sense of entitlement. Psychologists often describe this mindset as one driven by narcissistic obsession. For Mostafa, Suzanne wasn't just a woman he loved, she became an object of possession. Her independence and refusal to submit to his will transformed his love into rage. In his mind, her rejection could only be answered with punishment, and the ultimate punishment was her death. For al-Sukari, the hitman, the crime was less personal but no less disturbing. A former police officer, he had been trained to carry out orders without question. His role in Suzanne's murder revealed a chilling detachment, a willingness to kill for money without regard for the life he was taking. The financial reward of $2 million was enough to override any moral hesitation, and his calculated actions showed a cold, methodical approach to violence. Together, their psychological profiles paint a harrowing picture of a crime born from obsession, entitlement, and greed. Mustafa's refusal to let go and al-Sukari's ability to carry out the act with precision created a deadly combination that left Suzanne with no escape. The murder of Suzanne Tamim didn't just expose a personal tragedy, it revealed cracks in the very foundations of Egypt's political landscape. Hisham Talat Mustafa's conviction sent shockwaves through the ruling elite, exposing vulnerabilities and forcing uncomfortable questions about the intersection of power, privilege, and accountability. Mustafa's ties to Egypt's political elite were well known. As a close associate of Gamal Mubarak, the son of then-President Hosni Mubarak, Mustafa was seen as untouchable. His fall from grace shattered the illusion of invincibility surrounding Egypt's ruling class, exposing the darker side of its inner workings. Critics argued that the scandal highlighted systemic corruption, where personal connections and political influence blurred the lines between justice and privilege. The trial became a symbol of the growing discontent among Egyptians, who were already frustrated with the ruling elite's perceived impunity. For the Mubarak regime, the case was a public relations nightmare. It exposed not only the moral failings of one of their own, but also the fragility of their grip on power. The public's reaction to the case, particularly the outrage over Mustafa's eventual pardon, reflected a deeper dissatisfaction with a system that seemed to prioritize the elite over the people it governed. In many ways, the scandal foreshadowed the growing unrest that would eventually lead to the Egyptian Revolution of 2011. Suzanne Tamim's murder was not just a crime. It was a catalyst that revealed the deep fissures in Egypt's political and societal structures, leaving a legacy that extended far beyond the courtroom. For Suzanne Tamim's family, the tragedy did not end with her death. It only marked the beginning of a long, painful journey. Losing Suzanne in such a brutal and public manner was devastating enough, but the aftermath added layers of anguish as they fought to preserve her memory and demand accountability. The media frenzy surrounding the case thrust Suzanne's family into an unforgiving spotlight. Every detail of her life, from her career to her personal struggles, was dissected and sensationalized, leaving her loved ones to endure their grief under public scrutiny. At the same time, they faced daunting legal battles, challenging a justice system seemingly stacked against them by power and privilege. Through it all, the Tamim family stood firm, refusing to let Suzanne's voice be silenced by the forces that sought to erase her story. Their resilience became a testament to the enduring power of love and the unrelenting quest for justice, even in the face of overwhelming odds. More than a decade after Suzanne Tamim's murder, her case continues to spark debates about justice, privilege, and accountability. Were the legal outcomes sufficient, or did the powerful ultimately escape the full weight of justice? For many, the pardons of Hisham, Talat Mostafa, and Mohsen al-Sukari felt like a bitter reminder of the inequality that persists when wealth and influence are involved. The case also raises broader questions about how society deals with crimes committed by the elite. Does justice truly exist in a world where power can bend the rules? Or is the system inherently flawed, favoring those with connections and resources over those who cannot fight back? Suzanne's story remains a haunting example of how wealth and influence can intertwine with crime, often leaving the victims and their families to pick up the pieces while the powerful walk free. Her death, though tragic, serves as a stark reminder of the importance of holding even the most untouchable figures accountable. As we reflect on Suzanne Tamim's life and the tragic events that unfolded, we're left with crucial questions about justice, power, and accountability. What do you think? Did the legal system do enough to deliver justice for Suzanne, or was this another case where the elite evaded full responsibility? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what you believe should change in the pursuit of justice. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Crime Pulse Stories for more in-depth looks at real-life mysteries and the unanswered questions that still linger. Turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the world of crime and justice. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.